Comtesse de Montgeroux survived the French Revolution's guillotine by improvising, they say, in the courtroom. An improvisation of variations on the Marseillaise, the then revolutionary song of 1789, before it became the anthem of the Republic, prior to which she was a keyboard, harpsichord teacher of Marie Antoinette. And in a few years, things changing politically drastically, she, being a keyboardist, was spared the guillotine in order to become the first piano teacher of the Paris 1793 Conservatory Foundation. Subsequently, in 1820, she published a treatise about piano technique, and with over 200 etudes and everything in progression of difficulty, meticulous work, pedagogical work, musical work. What a destiny to adapt to the unexpected situations of the world. Beethoven earlier had been inspired by the young Bonaparte revolutionary before Napoleon emperor. And beyond taking off the dedication of his Third Symphony, Eroica, for him, he was observing the invasion of his city, Vienna, by the French troops of Napoleon, where Haydn supposedly was playing the Austrian anthem in the morning in front of the French guard in a very inspirational, I guess, pride and defiance to the French at the time invader. And paradox of paradoxes is that when Beethoven was commissioned during the Vienna Conference, or so-called, of the Allies who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, that was the Prussian, the Russian, the Austrian, and the English. Beethoven was commissioned to write music to be performed during these months of Vienna Congress, as they used to call it, for the conference after Napoleon's defeat. Interesting how composers adapted, just like Shostakovich, surviving the regime, writing cantatas and odes to the leaders, while writing music in the background that was not for there. It would be the eternal music. And all composers needed a job and necessarily adapted to the rulers. Haydn's Esterhazy contract would be considered today slavery. At the time was coveted. For some, Scarlatti becomes the teacher of the Queen of Spain's children and writes 500 and more exercizi, which the publisher since called sonatas, to teach the children of the court of Spain. Just like after Bach's death, his youngest son composer, Johann Christian, who was 15 at Bach's death in 1750, is rescued from poverty, because after Bach, the whole family was in demise financially. Handel brought him to London, where he went with his Prince of Hanover, who became King of England. And he found for him an opportunity to become teacher of the children of the Queen of England, after Scarlatti was the one of the Queen of Spain's children. And so did Johann Christian Bach, became J.C. Bach, and composed in London these compositions of his, included the sonatas for keyboard, which were originally fortepiano, yet to develop, but harpsichord to start with, adaptable, hybrid, today's word. And young Mozart child visiting Vienna, visiting London, visiting Paris, brought around by his manager father, Leopold, met Bach's youngest son, and as a child, prodigy Mozart, and he took the gift which J.C. offered him with his piano sonatas and transformed them, for the three of them, into piano concerti under his name of Mozart. But learned so much as well. Actually, he showed him also some prelude and fugue, since Johann Sebastian Bach was, until Mendelssohn rediscovers him in Leipzig 100 years after his death. Mozart knew little about Bach in comparison to what we do today of his oeuvre. But Johann Christian showed him prelude and fugues from the Well-Tempered Clavier, which Mozart transcribed for string trio or string quartet. Even Bach heard about Vivaldi writing Italian style, of course, Venetian, for violin concerto that some traveler brought the score of in Leipzig, which at the time traveling was so difficult, expensive, and perilous. And Bach did so little of it for financial reasons, and was curious to know. And then he adapted the concerto for 4 harpsichords, again without to name Vivaldi is the main author of this very piece, no more than Mozart did for his concerti based on J.C. Bach sonatas. I think it was just an appropriation that was expected at the time when there was no copyright. And in any case, composers had to provide so much material to survive, and music was consumed and not stored like today in recordings and publishings. Therefore, it had to be constantly produced, and the know-how was learned more than the inspiration that was necessary to it, which came almost as a bonus. And Bach's weekly cantatas, composed between Monday and Wednesday, rehearsed and copied before Saturday, and then performed on service on Sunday, and taken away by the church, since that was their ownership. So he writes another cantata the following week and never recycles other cantatas of before, even if people would have not remembered. And Bach didn't choose the simplicity, nor did Haydn for his 100 more symphonies, to write things that can be consumable and therefore quickly learned, quickly rehearsed, and quickly performed and quickly forgotten in the ephemeral necessity of their jobs to provide so much music for funerals, for birthdays, for commemorations, Te Deums, and like Lully did for Louis XIV, and Handel on the way to London with his Prince of Hanover attended a Te Deum that Lully composed for the bettering of the health of Louis XIV, the king, and he took the melody and put in "God Save the King" as new words for the anthem that he was asked to write in England. So you could call it borrowing, you could call it stealing, you could call it, and why would they, since they were so creative themselves? And as I said earlier, when so much in numbers had to be composed industrially while manufactured, they added complexity. Bach with chromaticisms and polyphony in each opening of a cantata choir, even if sung by the children who lived in the choir for the cantatas as church members, orphans of the city, and who didn't have the skills to sing complex chromatic fugal polyphony, but he did write them for beyond the ways of performance of the day, which were mostly rehearsed on the spot, performed on the spot, like Mozart piano concerti written during gatherings with his orchestra musicians. In real time, he would write the bars, they copy the parts in real time, and they read it, quote unquote, at the concert. So, in perspective, all performers were composers, so I guess they had the know-how to guess about the mishaps of a wrongly copied note, which happens all the time, even with careful editions centuries after, and with studies in schools of music where we learn their style, and we still need rehearsals, and they made it without any, for the necessity of surviving, because they had to write to go. If Mozart went somewhere in Paris or elsewhere, he wrote a symphony for the event where he could be invited, and nobody thought of asking them to play music of other composers, like Chopin, to play a Beethoven sonata in a salon. It was understood that he'll play his own, improvised or written, and if it was a success and it was commissioned, then he would publish it, just like Mozart's concerti piano part that he played was not written. Therefore, when published, he had to fill in what he improvised beyond the cadenza in it. It's mesmerizing to think about it compared to our very today detailed learning capacity, niche knowledge, deep awareness, but needing time to rehearse, practice, memorize. The spontaneity of music making with structure and complexity and polyphony. Today, most improvisations are considered jazz, which already has its own structure, even if it doesn't sound so compared to the written classical music, but is very complex in its own way. It has the flow, and that is something so meaningful. And when you think about composers like Montgeroux or even Clara, both women, who even Clara had to concede to a friend, it's true, a woman is not meant to write a large scope composition. This is like so discouraging from the points of view of today, because we would think Schumann would have encouraged her, instead of by marrying her, telling her to stop composing and play his. So you could say, yes, it is true, and I could say it. It's the cultural context that has to be understood, and not applying today's standards of equality of genders that was not then acceptable. Even my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, from her birth in 1887, and the Rome Prize and all these competitions, and imposing as a woman was already then still, like after Clara, which was in the earlier 19th century. It's, for us today, it's difficult to figure out how much prejudice was going on, political, gender, everywhere. and also the survival need of a composer of the time, performer, both. Vivaldi writing the Concerti for Leicester Harmonica Orchestra, he was conducting of the Orphans of Venice. Mozart writing music hand over fist to survive. Was such a quality instead of just expediting it, even saving Michael Haydn, the brother of Joseph, when he got drunk, having to submit a viola violin duo, series of duos. Mozart, in admiration of Joseph, wrote them on his behalf so that he doesn't get in trouble for missing the deadline. Yes, they expedited a lot, but with such subtlety, complexity, intensity, inspiration. Even if the music was not then, of course, when you have Clara performing Schumann and surviving him his lifetime almost, publishing him and performing him, then she separated the oeuvre from the composer in terms of the oeuvre by the composer, as it was performed later also with Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, or Mettner, and earlier by Liszt or Chopin or Mendelssohn. But Schumann needed Clara and Dutilleux, Madame Joie for his sonata and his preludes. Some composers had preferred performers and were not themselves the performers specifically on a specific instrument, or in general, the orchestration and the knowledge. Ravel, same way. And the piano is a universal instrument when you try to convey orchestra or different choral music. But still, the fugue, the concept of layered music, of the pulse, the form, the notation compared to the intention, for the freedom of the flow when you hear it without measures. But there are measures for rehearsal practices purposes, not for the mental slicing of the thoughts, but it brings a structure as well to the organization of the thoughts. And Montgeroux was doing that with her etudes before Chopin, since published in 1820, the generation of Chopin, Liszt, Mendelssohn, and Schumann were 9 to 11-year-olds when she published it, and she mentions to use the, at the time, marketed and therefore copyrighted for the publishers Melzel metronome, which was copyrighted in 1815. And so her educational etudes with specific preface for each purpose for the etudes study for the technique to accomplish on the fortepiano were possibly studied by students of Mr. Wieck, who was teaching probably these etudes, perhaps one of these great fours of 1809 to 11 born, at age 9 or 10 in around 1820, when the Montgeroux etudes were studying them. Of course, Beethoven's student, Czerny, besides a great sonata for piano and more, composed the famous etudes that many pianists practice to strengthen the fingers and the independence of fingers. That was after Montgeroux and before Chopin. And Chopin before Debussy, in the case of etudes that are really studies for technical, specific purpose of advancement at vanquishing a specific difficulty. Not the etudes like Bartók, Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff wrote, which are really more pieces of music than only studies for the purpose of them, or not staying on them, but going beyond the scope of that genre. Rachmaninoff calls his etude tableaus for paintings. And so it is true that it's fascinating to see how composers survived with demanding jobs, surviving techniques, and adapting to different religions. If Bach got the job with the B minor Mass, which he didn't get the job through presenting the B minor Mass as an audition piece for the Dresden Cathedral, where he would have become a Catholic music church composer, though he was a Protestant and a Lutheran, and so did he, in accordance to his faith, work for the St. Thomas Church, which was Lutheran in Leipzig. But he could have also done that. That's what he does with the Crucifixus of the Mass in B, with the Latin words, because it's a Catholic Mass that he presented for the job opportunity in Dresden. He used the opening of Cantata 12, Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Sagen, which in German as well, of course, that was to be, was a Lutheran cantata. So he even also understood that there is a universality of serving your faith, even if there are competing faiths between at the time the Protestants and the Catholics, for instance. I find all this very humbling to see that their creativity adapted to everything that needed to not only survive but leave something so incredibly important that today is our universal bread and butter of music. In the Masonic opera of Mozart, written when he was dying of poverty in Vienna with the magic flute, and so many examples of situations in which they find themselves and they manage to produce. I mean, Rachmaninoff in 1915, when Scriabin dies and they went to school together, he decides to and plays a tour of Russia during the civil war of the world war going around, World War I, within Russia to promote Scriabin's music after his death. And that traveling and playing in those times there must have been chaotic, but he did it for him. I find that beautiful and humble and inspirational. They say that Émile Guilels, after his concerts, praised Richter when people came to give him compliments after his recitals in the West. That's not something easily heard by famous pianists today, or else by humans today. I don't say they didn't have flaws, probably they were also having their flaws, but I find these examples to be very luminous. Mademoiselle Boulanger telling me that Fauré in his composition class, where she was a child student, Ravel was a teenager student, and the same time with the other students like Coquelin and Florent Schmitt and many others. Ravel, and of course older. Mademoiselle Boulanger told me that during his composition classes, he never gave examples of his own music, unlike Messiaen, who could not, and it was part of his teaching. People went to study, and that's how Rainsketch Tree by a Japanese composer studying with Messiaen sounds like Messiaen, and that's Poulenc's early music, like the bassoon and clarinet duo sonata sounds like the Soldier's Tale by Stravinsky, because inspiration, influence, learning comes in a territory. Painters learn by copying in the beginning the masters, and Bach himself, as a child orphan himself, had to learn his trade by copying music of others. And the E major fugue from Book 2 of the Well-Tempered Clavier is the same subject and most of the same fugue as Caspar Fischer's Ariadne Musica fugue, published before Bach, that he copied to study. And he used this fugue again without to name Caspar Fischer as the source of it, because no more than for Vivaldi for the concerto for violins, or Mozart for J.C. Bach for the sonatas for his early concerti. Borrowings, adapting, no more than Handel um, naming Lully for the melodic line of God Save the King, the Te Deum for Louis XIV. Isn't that amazing? How all these people managed amazing things in difficult times for each. There were always wars, like Prokofiev's war sonatas during World War II, Shostakovich Leningrad Symphony during the blockade, where he survived with the other survivors in horrible conditions. Britain's War Requiem. We could separate the oeuvre from the composer, the work from the creator, but in fact, in the context of their lives, either under the impossibility to emancipate themselves as women in music in the 19th century, very few did. Or like Georges Sand had to take a man's pen name for Aurore Dupin, or because rulers change, religions change, countries change. Gouvy was born in what was Prussia that became France, that was again Prussia before it became France. These are facts. And beyond that, their music is universal to us, and Mozart concerti, written on the spur of the moment, are so sophisticatedly, subtly complex, while beautifully simple in their expression once you manage them through learning them and rehearsing them. And they sight-read it on stage. Wow. I wish I was a little bird to hear it, how it sounded that day of February 1785 in Vienna for the D minor Mozart concerto, for instance. Or that Breitkopf organized dinner in the 19th century between attending Tchaikovsky, Brahms, and Grieg, and how they thought of each other or didn't think very highly of each other musically. Stravinsky also. Schumann wrote a whole magazine that he created, Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, where he criticized other composers. So start with Chopin. Liszt wrote his sonata after Schumann committed suicide and was in rehabilitation, and Clara received the score and writes to a girlfriend of hers, I don't know how to answer his kind letter that accompanies his sonata dedicated to Robert, because Brahms read it and it's such noise, ugly noise. So it can be misunderstood that Clara misunderstood the Liszt sonata's beauty and or rejected it, or Tchaikovsky thinking Brahms is a little bit too much Germanic and not enough emotional composer, and possibly Brahms thought this opposite of Tchaikovsky, but they did meet. I would have liked to also been there at that dinner, or the dinner between Stravinsky and Rachmaninoff, organized by their two respective wives, when they notoriously didn't appreciate each other, but in exile in America during World War II, that evening happened. Perhaps they just exchanged banalities, but nevertheless, the more you know, the more you understand to be humble about surviving your own hardships compared to the amount of hardships these creators surmounted. Thank you.